Bashari.
Jay-Z, whoever you are, nice to meet you.
Sorry, I've been just driving.
Ah, Jackie's wife. The Torah tells us that there is an obligation to sit in the sukkah for 7 days. And here the Torah does something which is relatively rare. The Torah also, in addition to giving us the mitzvah, also gives us the explanation for the mitzvah, the reason behind the mitzvah. Now, my ancestor, the Yisayid Aveda, learns that in any case where the Torah gives us the reason for a mitzvah, as opposed to the vast preponderance of mitzvahs where we're not given the actual reason spelled out in the Torah, the Yisayid Aveda learns that the reason for that is that the understanding of the mitzvah is integral to the performance of the mitzvah. And that if one does not take into consideration while doing the mitzvah, at least the basic explanation that the Torah has given, then he has not fulfilled the mitzvah. And the way the Torah describes the reason for the mitzvah of sitting in a sukkah, the Torah uses a very interesting way of expressing it. Hashem tells us, "L'man yedu dereseichem ki basukkos hoshbati es bnei Yisrael v'yitzi osam mi'eretz Mitzrayim." L'man yedu dereseichem, so that all of your future generations should be aware, ki basukkos hoshbati es bnei Yisrael, that in sukkahs I gave a place to dwell when I took them out of Mitzrayim. Now this pasuk is very, very difficult and from so many different points. And I want to focus on a few of those points. The first one, of course, being the grammar. Ki basukkos hoshbati es bnei Yisrael, for in sukkahs I dwelled the Jewish people. I settled the Jewish people. Sounds as if Hashem is saying, I took them and I picked them up and I put them into a sukkah. I forced them down. You know, like when a cop arrests somebody, obviously not a black person because their lives matter, but other people, when they get arrested, you know, like they put their hand on their head and they ease them into the car so they shouldn't be able to sue them for bumping their heads, right? That's what it sounds like. Ki basukkos hoshbati es bnei Yisrael. In the sukkah, I sat them down in the sukkah. That's not what the pasuk should have said. What the pasuk should have said is Ki basukkos yoshvu bnei Yisrael, or I gave them sukkahs so that they should be able to have a place to stay. But Ki basukkos hoshbati es bnei Yisrael, for in a sukkah I gave dwelling to the Yisrael when I took them out of Mitzrayim. The grammar of that pasuk is very, very difficult. That's point number one. Number two is, we have to wonder if the point of the mitzvah is L'man yedu dereseichem ki basukkos hoshbati es bnei Yisrael, that we should know this, and that we should know this for all generations, then I have a very good idea. Why not tell us that you did this? There are many nisim, many great chasodim that Hashem did for us when we were in the desert. For example, He gave us the man. For example, He gave us water. Those nisim, those chasodim, the Torah tells us explicitly, Jewish people didn't have what to eat, so Hashem gave them man. didn't have water to drink, so Hashem gave them water from a rock. The nace that Hashem so badly wants us to be aware of and to know about, by some weird coincidence, is the nace that the Torah never tells us about. Nowhere does the Torah say that Hashem gave us sukkahs for us to dwell in. And even according to the Manda Omar that we're referring to, the Anoni Akova, to the clouds that surrounded and protected Klal Yisrael, even according to that Manda Omar, nowhere does the Torah explicitly tell us that we were given these clouds surrounding us as a form of protection. The Torah does say that there was a cloud that led them along the way, that the Torah tells us, but nowhere does the Torah explicitly describe to us that surrounding us from all sides, above and below, there were clouds that were there to protect us. The Torah never even mentions that. And by some weird coincidence, the one chesed, the one miracle that Hashem is so desperate that we should know about for all generations, that's the one that he doesn't bother telling us about in the Torah. Yeah, in a backhanded fashion, he tells us, listen, I want you to have this mitzvah so that you should indeed be aware of the fact that I did this great chesed. No good. So if you want me to know that you did this great chesed, just write it in your Torah. If you write it in your Torah, then you can be sure that we will know about it for all generations. Do we know about the man? Is there a Yom Tov that tells us that we have to celebrate the giving of the man? No. Do we know about the water? Is there a Yom Tov that tells us that we have to celebrate the giving of the water? No. So how do we know about it? Very, very, very simple. Hashem wrote it in the Torah. Oh, yeah. Once it's written in the Torah, now all generations will know about it. Then comes along one chesed. Torah never mentions it. Doesn't say a word about it. This one you need to have a Yom Tov, where you need to rebuild your sukkah so that you should know about this great miracle that I never bothered telling you ever happened. It's a very strange thing. What's the trouble with that? Now the Bach asks this question, this specific point. He asks it in a slightly different form. The Bach asks this question on the Torah. He asks this question as a way to explain the Torah. And the answer that the Bach gives is, again, explaining what the Torah is trying to say, is that the point of this mitzvah is that we should be Zoiche Yetzias Mitzrayim. I hear. But that doesn't really answer the question, because I could have said exactly the same thing regarding the man. Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to take a can, to take a jar, and to fill it with a measure of man, and that this jar should be kept for all generations. Why? The man yiru es halechem asher hechalti es bnei Yisrael, that people should be able to see the food by which Hashem gave us sustenance when he took us out of Mitzrayim. According to the Bach, you could say the same thing about the man. You need to have some sort of mitzvah that is also Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. Then it could have been a Yom Tov about the man just as much. And so even though the Bach asks the question, the answer that the Bach is giving doesn't really answer the question. At best, it explains why the Torah focuses so much on the Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim. But it doesn't actually answer the question, why is it that of the three great miracles, the ones that are correlated to Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, the one about the Basuka, Hoshbati, as Bnei Yisrael, doesn't have any mention in the Torah. And not only does it not have any mention in the Torah, that's the one regarding which we're given a mitzvah. This is the one, says Hashem, that all generations need to know about. And good, so you can write it in your Torah. If you write it in your Torah, all generations will know about it. This is the second point that we need to understand. But here's the real problem. The pasuk says, "Ki basukos hoshbati es bnei Yisrael b'hitziosam mieretz Mitzrayim." For in sukkahs I gave dwellings to the Jewish people when I took them out of Mitzrayim. Who's the subject of the pasuk? Who's the subject? Hashem. Very good. The Gemara, when it darshans this pasuk, brings down a machlokes. According to Rabbi Akiva, it means actual sukkahs. According to Rabbi Elazar, according to Rabbi Akiva, it means Anoni HaKavod. According to Rabbi Elazar, it means actual sukkahs. But here's how the Gemara puts it. So Rabbi Akiva says that these are referring to the Anoni HaKavod. Ki basukos Hoshavti as Bnei Yisrael doesn't mean actual walls, sukkah walls and a covering. It means a protective surrounding, and it's a reference to the clouds that protected Klal Yisrael in the desert. Rabbi Elazar argues. Rabbi Elazar says no. It's referring to actual structures, booths, huts. But the way that the Gemara puts it is, and listen carefully to the lashon of the Gemara, says Rabbi Eliezer, Sukkos mamish asu lohem. Actual huts they made for themselves. Now wait, let's listen again to the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ki basukos hoshavti es bnei Yisrael b'yitzias me'eretz Mitzrayim." For in sukkahs I gave dwelling. That means that who is the supplier of this sukkah thing? Who's the subject of the pasuk? Hashem. How does the Gemara darshan this pasuk? Sukkos mamish asu lohem. That they themselves made sukkahs for themselves. Asu lohem. They made for themselves. I don't understand. I thought the pasuk that we're trying to explain is ki basukos hoshavti. So which one is it? Is it ki basukos hoshavti? Or is it asu lahem that they made it for themselves? Now it is true that this Gemara is brought down also in the Brais of Teras Koyanim, and there are two major differences in the Girsa. First of all, it switches around the opinions. It's Rabbi Eliezer saying that it's the Anoni HaKavod. That's the first thing that it does. And secondly, it expresses it differently. In Teras Koyanim, it says that according to Rabbi Eliezer, Anoni HaKavod Hayu, it's the Anoni, that's what it was, the clouds. And according to Rabbi Akiva, Sukkos mamish Hayu. They were actual sukkahs. Now, obviously, that girsa, right, that version works much better with the pasuk, because asu lahem, that they made for themselves, which is the version that we have in our Gemara, asu lahem, they made for themselves, seems to be the exact opposite of ki basukos hoshavti. Because ki basukos hoshavti, the subject is Hashem. Asu lahem, the subject is the people. So it's true that according to the Girs of the Teras Koyanim, it's a far better explanation. Sukkos mamish hayu. And then you could say they were actual sukkahs, but again, given to them by Hashem. But according to our Gemara, you can't say that. According to our Gemara, it's asu lahem. Now, the Aruch LaNer proves from Rashi and Chumash that Rashi had the Girsa as it appears in the Teras Koyanim because of a technicality. The technicality is just on the aside, so you should understand how we got there. The Gemara in Megillah says that Unkelus Hager wrote the Targum, and he was a Talmud of, who was he a Talmud of? Rabbi Eliezer. Unkelus Hager in his Targum translates ki basukos hoshavti to be referring to the Anoni HaKavod. Says the Aruch LaNer, obviously, if Unkelus is writing that it's a reference to the Anoni HaKavod, he must be holding like his Rabbi Eliezer, which only works according to the Girs in the Teras Koyanim, because according to our Girs, Rabbi Eliezer is the one who says that it was actual sukkahs. And Rashi and Chumash on the pasuk ki basukos hoshavti writes that it was a reference to the Anoni HaKavod, and he leaves out totally the other opinion that it was sukkahs mamish. Says the Aruch LaNer. So you see from Rashi and Chumash that he holds like the Targum, and the only way that we can make sense of the Targum is if we're going to learn like the Girs in the Teras Koyanim, that was Rabbi Eliezer who said Anoni HaKavod. That's the Aruch LaNer's raya, that Rashi must have had the Girsa as it appears in the Teras Koyanim, which is very nice when you want to understand how Hoshavti could somehow be referring to sukkahs, because like we said, the Girsa that we have in our Gemara, the version that we have in our Gemara, doesn't sit very well with the way that the pasuk is composed. But the Mechilas Kveidai of the Aruch LaNer, Nela Mimenu Divrei Rashi, he must have not noticed Rashi on the daf. Because Rashi on the daf In Dibur HaMaschil, Sukkos Mamish, Rashi writes like this: B'sha'as chaniyasam, at the time that they would stop their travels and they would camp, Hayu oisin sukkos, they would make for themselves sukkahs, which means that Rashi for sure did not have the girsa as it appears in the Teras family. Rashi most certainly had the girsa as it appears in our Gemara. That ki basukos Hoshebati as bnei Yisrael is either the Anonei HaKavod or that they themselves made actual sukkahs. Once we understand that even Shittas Rashi is that they, like the girsa that we have in our Gemara, that they made for themselves sukkahs, we're back to our question. How could the pasuk ki basukos Hoshebati as bnei Yisrael, which seems to be describing some chesed that Hashem did for Klal Yisrael, how then could it be explained as to mean that sukkos mamish asu lahem, that they themselves made sukkahs? It seems to be a contradiction, almost like the opposite of what Hoshebati as bnei Yisrael would be referring to. And so these are the three main issues that we have to deal with when trying to understand this pasuk. And I'm going to review them again. Issue number one is the grammar. Ki basukos Hoshebati. What does that mean? Ki basukos Hoshebati. Issue number two is, why is it that of the three great chasodim that correspond to the Shlosh Royim, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, the very one of which the Torah never tells us is the one for which we have a mitzvah so that we should remember it for all generations, while the other two, not only is it that there is no mitzvah that we should remember it for all generations, but by virtue of the fact that the Torah told us about it, we therefore automatically are aware of it for all future generations. That's issue number two. And issue number three is the Gemara itself, the way that the Gemara actually expresses the drasha ki basukos Hoshebati, if that's the pasuk that we're darshaning, Hoshavti, I gave them to dwell, how then could the Gemara claim that it's sukkos mamish asu lahem, that it was actual sukkahs that they made for themselves, if the pasuk says Hoshebati? These are the three main points, the three main issues that I want to address tonight. So everybody is familiar with the Mishnah Berurah at the very beginning of Hilchos Sukkah, Siman Tov Reish Kaf Hei, where the Mishnah Berurah brings down on the Mechaber over there quotes this pasuk, Ki basukos Hoshebati as bnei Yisrael, and the Mechaber, like Rashi in Chumash, and like the Targum, paskins like the Manda Omar, that it is a reference to the Anonei HaKavod. On that line in the Mechaber, the Mishnah Berurah brings down the question: if it's really true that basukos Hoshebati as bnei Yisrael happened when Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, why then is it that we celebrate Sukkot 6 months after Yetzias Mitzrayim? We should celebrate Sukkot at the same time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. Sukkot and Pesach should really happen at the same time. Now, it is important that you should know that the Rashbam and the Rambam disagree fundamentally with the entire question. Both of them learn that the sukkahs that Hashem is discussing here in this pasuk only actually came into being in the winter months. And therefore, according to the Rashbam and the Ramban, this question that the Mishnah Berurah is asking would never even start. Masha'enkein, the Ibn Ezra learns over there, like the way the Mishnah Berurah is asking the question, that Ki basukos Hoshebati, according to the Ibn Ezra, is a reference to the place, Sukkos, which indeed happened at the same time of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So, assuming that we're going to learn like the Ibn Ezra, that Ki basukos Hoshebati is referring to something that occurred at the same time as Yetzias Mitzrayim, asks the Mishnah Berurah, why then do we celebrate it in the month of Tishrei? And the Mishnah Berurah brings down that the answer is because in the month of Nisan, which is in the spring, and the weather is so nice, anyhow, people have the tendency to sit out in their backyards, in their gazebos, to enjoy the pleasant weather. But in the beginning of the rainy season, which is Tishrei, that's when people have the tendency to move away from sitting out in their backyards. You never know when it's going to rain. Says the Mishnah Berurah, therefore Hashem didn't give us the mitzvah in the month of Nisan where it wouldn't be an obvious performance of Hashem's Ratzon, because then it could be misconstrued to just be a pleasantry thing. The weather is so nice, people anyhow move out into their backyards to enjoy it. So maybe that's why you're sitting in this sukkah. But by giving us the mitzvah in the month of Tishrei, which is the beginning of the rainy season, by giving us this mitzvah in the month of Tishrei, now it becomes far more obvious that the reason why we are performing this mitzvah is because Hashem has commanded us to do so. That's the Mishnah Berurah's explanation for this. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is purportedly quoting the Torah. The problem is that there is one minor difference between the way the Torah says it and the way the Mishnah Berurah claims the Torah says it. And this minor difference has major ramifications. Here's what the Torah says. The Torah says exactly the same thing. During the beginning of the spring, people anyhow have the tendency to move out into their backyards, sit in gazebos, enjoy the weather. But in the rainy season, they don't. Therefore, says the Torah, in order that it should be Yera'el Lakol, obvious to all, says the Torah, in order that it should be Yera'el Lakol, visibly so, obviously so, to all people, that's why Hashem gave us the mitzvah in the month of Tishrei instead. The Mishnah Berurah, when he quotes the Torah, does not say that. The Mishnah Berurah, when he quotes the Torah, is Bezeh Mar'eh. And with this, he shows, he doesn't write, Bezeh Yera'el Lakol, with this it shall be obvious to all who observe. The Mishnah Berurah writes, Bezeh Mar'eh, with this he shows that he's doing it for the Ratzon Hashem. Now you understand, it's a minor difference, but it's a massive difference. Because according to the way the Mishnah Berurah is understanding the Torah, who is the one who is supposed to be receiving this obvious message? According to the Mishnah Berurah's understanding of the Torah, who's the one who's supposed to be receiving the message, right? The obviousness of this message. The person who's sitting in the sukkah, right? With this he shows that he's doing it because Hashem has said so. Masha'enken, according to the way that the Torah actually writes it, who is it that's supposed to be affected by the obviousness? Everyone else. And therefore one has to wonder, why indeed did the Etz Chaim understand the Torah the way he did? To me, it's tzarchi, and I don't know why the Etz Chaim saw it this way. But the way that the Torah puts it is, with this, it shall now be made seen, be made obvious to all observers that the reason why you're performing the mitzvah is because Hashem has said so. Now, there's an additional, a corollary question on the way the Mishnah Berurah is understanding it, and that is, according to him, that the one who's supposed to be receiving the message of this obviousness is the performer of the mitzvah. Why then don't we have to do something like that for every single mitzvah in the Torah? What's so special? Why is Sukkah so unique that it's the type of mitzvah that I have to make sure that it's obvious to me that I'm doing it because Hashem said so? Or you should say that you would need to do something like that for. And yet, for some reason, it's only the mitzvah of Sukkah. Now, it's true that you could ask the same exact question on the Torah, All the mitzvahs I should be able to say, I have to be Marla cold and I'm doing it for, because Hashem said to do it. But at least there you could understand that the direction to answer that question for the Torah, there must be something about the mitzvah of sukkah that demands obviousness from the outside observers. Masha'enke, and according to the way that the Mishmar is learning, what direction would you use to answer the question? Why is it that sukkah would be so different, so unique from all the other mitzvahs, that I have to do something, Hashem has to mamish change the date, so that the person should be able to recognize that the reason why he built this funny structure is because Hashem told him to. Anyhow, he knows very well that the reason why he built this structure is because Hashem told him to. And so for me, the way the Mishmar is understanding the Torah is tzarchin, I don't understand why he sees it that way, but I want to focus a little bit on the Torah himself. Going with the Torah has now introduced us to something which actually travels through and travels throughout the entire mitzvah of sukkah. Because what the Torah is really saying is that there is something about this mitzvah that has to be made clear, not to the Jew who is performing it, but to all who see the Jew who is performing it. That is to say, even the goyim of the world, that the reason why he is sitting in this sukkah is because Hashem has told him to do so. That concept, that for some odd reason, the guy's understanding of our sitting in the sukkah is somehow operative to the mitzvah of sukkah, is something that travels throughout Chazal, throughout the Torah and throughout Chazal. The most obvious, of course, being the fact that Chazal tell us that the reason why we bring as part of our korbanos musaf the parim in the number that we do, which if you add them all up day by day, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, you add them up day by day, it comes out to 70. Say Chazal, the 70 parim, the 70 cows that are brought as part of the musafim are brought on behalf of the goyim. And anyone who paid attention to the haftarah that we read on the first day of Sukkot would have noted the strangest thing about Sukkot. And that is that the entire nevuah focuses on the obligation that the goyim have to take part in this celebration that we call the mitzvah of Sukkot. And the terrible devastation that will occur to those goyim who are incapable or unwilling or unable to take part in this mitzvah that we call Sukkot. And most mind-blowing of all is the famous Gemara in Avodah Zarah. That the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says as follows: the goyim will have a claim against the Borei himself. They'll say to him, "You gave the Jews the Torah, so what do you expect? Obviously, they were closer to you. You never gave us the Torah." And so Hashem says to them, "No good. But what about the Shavim mitzvahs b'nei Noach? What about those mitzvahs that I gave you, and even those you didn't keep?" Nonetheless, the goyim have a counter argument. They demand that Hashem give them a mitzvah. Now, how many mitzvahs do we have in the Torah? How many mitzvahs? 613. The goyim demand, give us a mitzvah. 613 mitzvahs. And what's the mitzvah that Hashem gives them? The mitzvah of sukkah. What happens, says the Gemara? It gets a little bit warm, and the guy gets uncomfortable in his sukkah, so he packs out. Says the Gemara, at that moment Hashem laughs at them. See, he says, this simple mitzvah of sukkah I gave you, and even this you couldn't handle. That's what the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says. Obviously, it's an abridged version of how the Gemara says it. What? Paraphrase. So looking at it from the perspective of the Torah, that is to say, that there is something about the mitzvah of sukkah that demands that even the guy be able to note that the Jew is doing it because Hashem gave us this mitzvah is not something that is limited only to the change in the date between the month of Nisan and the month of Tishrei, but it seems to be something that runs throughout the entire mitzvah of Sukkah. There is something about the mitzvah of Sukkah that demands that the Goy recognize that this is something that the Jew is performing, and not only that the Goy recognize that this is something that the Jew is performing because the Goy told him so, but that it is something that becomes now definitive of the difference between Goy and Yisrael. And why do I say that? Because of that Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Because the Goy is saying the difference between the Jew and the Goy is that you gave them a Torah. That's not fair. Says Hashem, fine, I'll give you a mitzvah. That mitzvah is Sukkah. They're unable. And with that, it is now set that indeed Yisrael is fundamentally different than the Ummah Yisrael. There is something about this mitzvah of Sukkah that packages, explains, puts into glaring perspective what it is to be a Yisrael as opposed to what it is to not be a Yisrael. And so when the Torah tells us this simple change in the wording, not bazem mare, the way the Derech Etz Chaim quotes him, but the way he actually writes it, ubazeh yirah lakol, the Torah is taking one word, that one word changes everything. It becomes an entirely different concept than the way the Mishmar is understanding the Torah. And it's this point, this specific element, that in the mitzvah of Sukkah, that now becomes the definitive difference between the Yisrael and the Ummah Yisraelim. It is this point that is going to answer our three issues that we had with the pasuk. The superficial, the surface understanding of that pasuk is Ki basukei Hoshbati es bnei Yisrael, that Hashem is describing a chesed that He did for us. That's the surface understanding. And indeed, if you learn that it is a reference to the Ananei HaKavod, that's an undeniable fact. It is a tremendous chesed. However, if you learn like the other Manda Amar that it's Sukkos Mamish, where's the chesed? But that there were huts for them to stay in, saying anybody goes anywhere, they can take a tent with them. So mainly you learn like the Manda Omar that it's Ananei HaKavod, I hear. The claim that the pasuk, as it on the surface seems to be saying, is describing a chesed that the Beirei did with Yisrael. But you see that there's a machlokes. You see that there's a Manda Omar who holds that it refers to actual sukkahs. Where's the chesed in that? That they took along material by which to build something so as to be protected from the elements? That's a chesed that the Beirei has done for them? Where? What? Why? How? And so the very fact that there is a machlokes as to what the sukkahs are referring to already gives us a certain insight that, contrary to the surface reading, that we're being told here that there is a tremendous chesed, clearly that's not what the pasuk is trying to describe. But more importantly, the Navi tells us as follows. Koyamar Hashem, Zacharti loch chesed me'urayich ahavas keluloisai. I take into account the love and the chesed that you showed me. And what love and chesed did we show Hashem? Lechtech acharai bamidbar be'eretz lo zerua. That you were willing to follow me into the desert, into a land that does not offer any growth. And nonetheless, you followed me into it. So who did chesed to who? Here the Navi is saying, Koyamar Hashem, Zocharti loch chesed nu'urai. I am taking into account the chesed that you did in those early years. Ahavas kelulei sayich, the love that existed between us at that time where we bonded. So Hashem is saying, I'm taking into account your chesed towards this. And then we're claiming that here, is a reference to Hashem's chesed to us. Make up your mind. Whose chesed to whom is it that we're supposed to be taking into account? And so therefore, on the basis of this nevuah, and in addition to what I pointed out earlier, that according to the Manda Amar, that it's sukkis mamish asulahem, where l'chora on the surface, I don't see any chesed there. I would like to suggest an alternative understanding to what it is that the Beirei is trying to tell us. And in order to do that, I first want to define the word chesed. Koyamar Hashem, Zocharti loch chesed neurai, ahavas kelulei sayich. I take into account the chesed of those early years, the love shown when we were betrothed, kelulei sayich, where we bonded, where we became as one. That you are willing to follow me into the desert, even though it's a place in which there is nothing growing, nonetheless you follow me. The word chesed could be best defined in an English term as the word commitment. We borrow the term chesed to refer to any behavior which is a reflection of commitment to something. It reflects the fact that I'm committed. And so we use the term to refer to all of those things. Since I am committed, I do X or Y or Z. And those things, X, Y, and Z, is now what we call the chesed. But that's not actually accurate. The chesed is the commitment. The X, Y, and Z are merely a reflection of that chesed. And commitment itself needs to be understood in the context. Commitment could be described as follows. You're the Yisrael, you're coming out of Mitzrayim. You have no idea whatsoever what this journey is going to be like. No idea. And to be honest, the desert is really not all that great a place to hang out. There's lots of scary stuff there, as the pasuk itself describes. Snakes, scorpions, terrible thirst, no food, lots of challenges. You might end up here, you might end up there. You might find yourself suddenly blocked by a big sea that doesn't allow you to travel onwards. There's also many interesting possibilities. The point is that there's an adventure here, and you have no idea what's in store for you. And nonetheless, you jump into it anyhow. You didn't hesitate. You didn't say to yourself, well, why don't we wait till tomorrow? Maybe tomorrow a better scenario will open up. Let's just wait till tomorrow. Let's wait till next week. Maybe we'll find a better way to get out there instead of having to go into the desert. You set out on this journey, and despite all of the difficulties, you don't give up. You don't look back. You don't question. whenever you negotiate with the Borei, it's for the mutual benefit of this relationship. It's not self-centered. Trust, commitment, foundations of loyalty. In short, totally dedicated to the relationship. That's commitment. That's what Hashem is describing. Zacharti lo chesed me'urai. Ahavas kelulei soy. Perhaps, here's what the pasuk is saying. L'man yedu derei seichem, all of your future generations need to be aware that the best I could offer them was to give them some random huts. Not that we're describing the tremendous chesed that Hashem did to us. The exact opposite. It's describing the lack of anything. The best I could do is give them some huts. L'man yedu derei seichem, all generations need to be aware ki basukei seishafti es b'nei Yisrael. Nothing more, nothing less. Just random sukkahs. That's what I did. And nonetheless, what happened? He followed me anyhow. Ki basukei seishafti es b'nei Yisrael is a description of what the Navi is saying. Zacharti lo chesed nu'raich. Not that it's describing some amazing magical thing that Hashem did to us. The opposite. It's describing something that didn't have amazing or magical properties. Just random huts that you yourself had to bang together. That was the best I was offering you. And nonetheless, you followed me into the desert. This, says Hashem, is what I need all generations to be aware of, because this is an actual living of the Zacharti lo chesed nu'raich ahavas kelulei soy. It's not like the manna, which was a great miracle, magical and amazing, and a tremendous chesed. It's not like the be'er, the water, magical, amazing. Hashem giving us it. No, it's the opposite. It was the lack of everything. I'm not giving you anything. And yet you still followed me into the desert. Because of what? Because of commitment. Chesed. Yisrael is committed to this relationship. When the guy comes and says to Hashem, not fair, you gave them a Torah, says Hashem, no problem. The difference between the Yisrael and the guy is this. Here, take a sukkah, will you live in it? And what happens? The guy won't live in it. Why not? Because it's not magical and amazing. But the Yisrael, does he live in it? Of course he lives in it. Memela, says the Torah, the whole purpose of the mitzvah is l'man yedu derei seichem ki basukei seishafti es b'nei Yisrael. The whole purpose of the mitzvah is this: the definitive difference between what it means to be a Yisrael and what it isn't to be a Yisrael. Chesed nu'urayich, not chesed nu'urayich. And therefore it has to be Yeira elakol. The guy needs to see that. For the mitzvah of sukkah is the glaring, definitive difference between what it means to be a Yisrael and what it means to be a guy. The Mela says the Torah, yep, even if that means having to change the date. Because what could be more important than Yeira elakol? That we sit here because Hashem told us. Zacharti lo chesed ne'urayich ahavas kelulei soy is in the real through the mitzvah of sukkah. Laman yedu derech seichem ki basukos hoshavti es bnei. So that, says Hashem, is what all generations need to be aware of. And with this, all three questions that we posed on the pasuk are neatly wrapped up and resolved. It is not the same as the man. It is not the same as the be'er. There was no magic. It's the lack of all magic. What should Hashem say? I gave you sukkahs? I didn't. Even that I didn't give you. I gave you nothing. That's what you need to remember. The willingness to follow me into the desert where you are not given anything. There's no guarantee, you have no idea what's in store for you. And nonetheless, total and utter trust, commitment, loyalty. That's the mitzvah of sukkah. Says the pasuk, "Ki basukos hoshavti es bnei Yisrael." Says the Gemara, according to that man, Omar, sukkos mamish asu lahem. They had to make the sukkahs. I put them in a situation where they had to make the sukkahs. Even that wasn't the guarantee that they were going to have a place to live. And nonetheless, they followed me into the desert. The chesed, the commitment, the definitive difference between the Yisrael and the Am comes down to the mitzvah of sukkah. And this is something, says Hashem, Laman yedu derech seichem. It's not something that I want you to know in your minds. It's something that I want you to do. If this is what defines the Yisrael, the chesed me'uraychi, this is what defines the Yisrael. I don't want you to know that this happened. Good, the man, you need to know a great miracle, shkoyach. No, you need to live it. You need to do it. You need to be it. Zocharti lo chesed me'uraychi needs to be a living constant. That commitment, that willingness to move out into nothing for the simple reason that Hashem is taking us on this adventure. Says the pasuk, Laman yedu derech seichem ki basukos hoshavti es bnei. That's the mitzvah of sukkah. Memela, should it come as a shock that this is the mitzvah that follows the Yemei Hadin? That this is the mitzvah in which culminates the Yemei Hadin? The Yemei Hadin, the days of din, are not days of anger. The days of din are days of closeness. I only care and I only respond when I care. The opposite of love is not hate, but indifference. Din is not indifference. Din is a statement. I am not indifferent. And so, of course, if you have din, it follows logically that then you should have a mitzvah of chesed nurayich. Does everybody hear what I'm saying? And so, Memela, on the very last day of Sukkot, after actually living it in the flesh, this chesed nurayich, not saying the words, not professing that I have commitment, but actually, practically, reliving that commitment on that last day after having done this, and it's now part of how we are living our life. Now is the time to ask for all of those things that Hashem ultimately gave us, even in the desert. Water, man, love, care. And this is why the last day of Sukkot has become a day where that's exactly what we do. Where again and again and again we plead and we beg, Hoshana on this matter, Hoshana on that matter. And then again, Hoshana on this, Hoshana on that. Why not? If Hashem is saying, Zacharti lach, I'm taking into account chesed me'urayich, ahavas kavul oisayich, what better time could there be to ask for all of these things than now? And so indeed, Hoshana Raba becomes now the climax of all of the Yemei Hadin. It's the moment in which everything that was accomplished and everything that was meant to be achieved and everything that we strive to achieve actually comes to a practical climax. And so on this day, after having reaffirmed this commitment as described in the pasuk, we then turn to the Beirei and say, okay, so we're in this, right? We're in this. We're committed. We're living that commitment. Hoshana. So Hoshana in this matter and Hoshana in that matter. This is the day of Hoshana Raba. The ability to appreciate and the recognition that it is merely a real time of Zacharti lo chesed me'urayich means that it is a natural progression and a natural outcry for Hoshana. And this is why in our tradition, Hoshana Raba is not only the end of the Yemei Hadin, but the climax of the Yemei Hadin. I wish you all Igmar Chsima Tova, a guten Kvittel, and we'll see you all hopefully tomorrow by Shachris, right? When we actually go around and ask Hoshana for all of these matters. A guten Yom Tov, a guten Yom Tov. Because that's exactly what Hashem is saying. I forced them into this situation where they can. Good Mayed, everybody. Good Mayed. Good Mayed.